I was folding towels on a Tuesday afternoon when my mother-in-law's voice came through the hallway, low and pleased with itself. The way people sound when they think no one important is listening. Once the papers are signed, she won't have a leg to stand on, she said. The house goes to Daniel and Daniel alone. That woman's name won't be anywhere near that deed. I stood there with a warm towel in my hands, and I did not move. I did not drop it. I did not gasp. I folded it in half, then in half again, the way I always do, corners matched, and I set it on top of the pile. Then I walked to the hallway closet and I listened to the rest. My mother-in-law, Carol, was on the phone with her attorney, going over the language of a new deed for the house my husband and I had lived in for 6 years. A deed that, according to her, would list only my husband's name. A deed that would erase me completely from a home I had paid into every single month since the day we moved in. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I just went back to folding the towels. Because there was something Carol didn't know. Something none of them knew. My name was already on that deed. It had been for 3 years. And I was about to let them find that out on their own terms. In their own time. In front of everyone. My name is Renata Voss. I'm 39 years old, and I've spent the last 14 years as a real estate title attorney. My job, in plain terms, is to make sure that when someone buys a piece of property, the ownership is exactly what everyone agrees it is. No hidden liens, no forged signatures, no quiet little omissions that surface 5 years later and destroy a family. I read documents for a living. I read the spaces between what people say and what the paperwork actually says. And if there is one thing 14 years in this profession teaches you, it's this. People lie constantly, casually, and with total confidence, right up until the moment a document proves otherwise. Paper doesn't lie. People do. I believed, for most of my adult life, that if you were honest and thorough and did the right thing quietly, without making noise, without demanding credit, that the people around you would eventually see it and respect it. That was the belief that shattered in that hallway, holding a warm towel, listening to my mother-in-law plan my erasure like she was picking out curtains. I met Daniel when I was 29. He was warm in a way that felt safe rather than showy. The kind of warm that makes you lower your guard slowly, over months, not all at once. His family, the Hargroves, were close-knit in the way that looks beautiful from the outside and can feel suffocating from the inside. Constant dinners, constant opinions, constant involvement in decisions that, in most families, would belong only to the couple making them. Carol Hargrove, Daniel's mother, was the center of that gravity. She was sharp, controlled, and endlessly charming to people she considered useful, and quietly dismissive of people she didn't. For the first 2 years, I thought I fell into the first category. I was wrong. I fell into a third category entirely. A temporary category. A placeholder. Someone to be tolerated until she was no longer necessary. When Daniel and I bought the house, it was Carol who suggested, gently, warmly, the way she suggested everything, that it might be simpler if the property was just in Daniel's name for now. For tax purposes, she said. You two can sort out the rest later. There's no rush. It's just paperwork. I remember how reasonable it sounded. I remember how much of our life together sounded reasonable in the moment and only revealed its shape years later, once I could see the whole pattern instead of one conversation at a time. But I did something Carol didn't expect. Because of my profession, because I have spent my career watching what happens to women who trust verbal promises about property, I quietly insisted, calmly, without making it a fight, that my name go on the deed alongside Daniel's. I didn't frame it as suspicion. I framed it as standard practice, which, professionally, it is. Daniel agreed without much thought. He wasn't hiding anything from me. He simply never told his mother. For 6 years, I ran 2 lives inside one marriage. In one life, I was Renata, wife, partner, someone who cooked dinner on Sundays and helped Daniel's younger sister, Priya, move apartments twice, and sat through every holiday at the Hargrove house with a smile that took real effort by the 3rd hour. In the other life, I was the outsider who had married into a family that had already decided, quietly and permanently, that I would never fully belong. Priya was the one who almost made it bearable. She was younger than Daniel by 6 years, funny, sharp-tongued in a way that made family dinners survivable, and for a long time I believed she was genuinely on my side. She would roll her eyes at her mother's comments the second Carol left the room. She would text me afterward, "She's exhausting. I'm sorry." And I believed her, because I wanted to believe someone in that house saw me as a person rather than a placeholder. But admiration and envy wear the same face, and it would take me years to learn how to tell them apart in her. The struggles I mostly carried alone. I never told Daniel how many times his mother corrected the way I loaded the dishwasher in her own kitchen, or referred to the house as Daniel's house in front of guests while I stood 2 feet away. I told myself it wasn't worth the conflict. I told myself, marriages survive by choosing your battles. What I didn't understand yet was that I wasn't choosing my battles. I was slowly agreeing to fight none of them, and Carol was taking notes on exactly how far that would go. So when I stood in that hallway with a warm towel in my hands, listening to Carol tell her attorney to draw up a deed that erased me, I wasn't only hearing a betrayal. I was hearing 6 years of small, quiet signals finally arrive at their conclusion. I want to take you back to that moment now, because the first time I told it, I skipped past what it actually felt like to stand there. Carol's voice was clipped and businesslike, the voice she used with contractors and caterers, not the honeyed voice she used with Daniel. I don't want any ambiguity, she was saying. Once his father's estate closes, that house needs to be entirely his. I don't want a repeat of what happened with his cousin's divorce. Draw it up clean, one name. There was a pause, then, no, she doesn't know anything about this, and she won't, until it's done. I stood in the hallway for what felt like a long time, but was probably 90 seconds. I remember the exact texture of the towel against my palms. I remember thinking, with a strange cold clarity, that this was the moment. Not the moment of heartbreak, that would come later, in smaller doses, spread out, but the moment where I stopped being a person who reacted to what happened to her, and became a person who decided what would happen next. I did not confront Carol. I did not confront Daniel that night either. Even though he came home an hour later, kissed my forehead, and asked what was for dinner as if the ground beneath our marriage hadn't just shifted. I made dinner. I asked about his day. I said nothing. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and made the first of what would become dozens of quiet, methodical moves. I pulled the county recorder's records for our property. I confirmed, in black and white, digitized and timestamped, that my name, Renata M. Voss, had been listed as a joint tenant on the deed for 3 years, 1 month, and 11 days. Carol could plan whatever fictional deed she wanted. It would mean nothing without my signature, and she didn't know that yet. My rule, from that point forward, was simple, and it's a rule I'd recommend to anyone who finds themselves standing where I stood. Gather everything before they know you've seen it. The moment someone realizes you're onto them, they stop leaving evidence and start managing a narrative instead. I had one advantage Carol didn't know I had, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as it served me. Over the following weeks, I did what I do professionally, except this time the case file was my own life. I requested certified copies of the deed, the original purchase agreement, and every amendment filed since we bought the house. I cross-referenced the new deed Carol's attorney was allegedly preparing against the actual chain of title, and confirmed what I already suspected. Without my signature releasing my interest, any document attempting to transfer sole ownership to Daniel would be legally void. Carol's attorney either didn't know I was on the deed, or Carol hadn't told him. Given what I would learn later, I suspected the second. I also started paying closer attention to things I had let slide for years. Small comments from Carol's friends at family gatherings, an offhand remark from Daniel's father, Walter, before he passed, about keeping things simple so there's no confusion down the line. A conversation I'd overheard once, months earlier, between Carol and her sister, about protecting what's ours, a phrase I had brushed off at the time as generic family talk. It wasn't generic. It was a plan that had been running in the background of my marriage for years, and I had simply never had the right documents in front of me to see its shape. People who think they'll never get caught leave the messiest trails, because they've never had to be careful. Carol had spent 6 years operating on the assumption that I was too polite, too eager to keep the peace, too grateful to be included, to ever look closely at anything. That assumption was the crack I worked into. Within a month, I had built a file, financial records, the certified deed, email correspondence Carol had accidentally included me on years earlier when discussing family estate planning that never mentioned my name once, and a timeline showing exactly when the plan to remove me had likely begun. It traced back further than I expected. Almost 4 years. Nearly the entire time I'd believed I was slowly being accepted into this family, Carol had been quietly working to ensure I could be removed from it. But here's where the story stopped being simple, and became something I didn't expect. Buried in an old email thread, one Carol had forwarded to Walter, and, apparently by accident, to Daniel's old family email account that I still had partial access to from years earlier, helping him set up a shared calendar, I found a message that didn't fit the pattern. It wasn't about the house. It was about money. A trust, established years before Daniel and I even met, structured in a way that seemed designed to benefit Priya far more than Daniel, despite family gatherings where Carol always insisted, loudly and often, that everything gets split evenly between my children. It didn't make sense with the rest of the story. If Carol's plan was simply to protect the family's assets from outsiders like me, why would she also be quietly maneuvering to disadvantage her own son in favor of her daughter? Something else was happening beneath the surface, something that had nothing to do with me at all. I had walked into the middle of a much older story, one that started years before I ever met the Hargroves. I sat on that discovery for almost 2 weeks before I understood it, and when I finally did, it came from somewhere I never expected. Priya called me on a Thursday night, her voice already unsteady before she said a single real sentence. She asked if she could come over. I said yes, mostly out of habit, and mostly because some part of me, the part that still hadn't fully accepted what Carol was doing, hoped this was Priya finally choosing to be honest with me about something. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had spread out Carol's records weeks earlier, and she told me the truth in pieces, the way people do when they've been carrying something too long and it's finally coming apart in their hands. The trust wasn't about favoritism, it was about guilt. Years before Daniel and I met, Priya had been in a serious accident, one the family rarely spoke about, one I'd only ever heard referenced in vague, closed-off terms. What I didn't know, what I had never been told, was that the accident happened because of a decision Carol made. A decision to let Priya drive that night, against Walter's wishes, because Carol didn't want to interrupt a dinner she was hosting to go pick her up herself. Priya had been badly hurt. The medical costs, the long recovery, the trust fund built quietly afterward, all of it traced back to a choice Carol had never told anyone she'd made, and a guilt she had spent nearly 2 decades trying to outrun by controlling everything else she possibly could. The plan to remove me from the deed wasn't only about me. It was about control, about Carol's need, after failing to protect one child in the one moment that mattered most, to control every other outcome in the family, so completely that nothing could ever surprise her, hurt her, or implicate her again. I was collateral in a much older war Carol was fighting against her own guilt. Priya confirmed the accident details had been verified years earlier through the family's own attorney and a settlement document Walter had kept, quietly, in a lockbox Priya had found after his death. She showed me a copy, an official accident report, an insurance settlement statement, and a handwritten note from Walter, dated years before, that simply read, "Carol knows this was her call. She will never say it out loud. Keep this in case she ever needs to be reminded." I sat there at my own kitchen table, holding a decades-old piece of paper that reframed everything, and I felt something shift in me that had nothing to do with anger. For years I had carried a quiet, low-grade guilt of my own. The sense that maybe I simply wasn't likable enough, wasn't warm enough, hadn't tried hard enough to be fully accepted into this family. That guilt evaporated in that kitchen. It had never been about me. It had never been about anything I could have done differently. I had just been standing in the blast radius of a secret that predated me by nearly 20 years. I didn't rush to use what I now knew. If anything, it made me more careful. This wasn't only my story to expose, but it did change how I planned the next part. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't happen because of anything I did. It happened at Walter's memorial dinner, 3 months after his passing, the kind of family gathering Carol had spent her whole life orchestrating to project exactly the image she wanted. I wasn't in the room when it started. I heard it afterward, in full, cinematic detail, from Daniel's uncle Marcus, who called me the next morning still sounding shaken. He told me Carol had stood to give a toast, composed as ever, glass raised, when Priya, quietly, without warning, without raising her voice, stood up across the table and asked Carol, in front of 30 relatives, whether she was going to finally tell everyone the real reason the trust existed, or whether she was going to let Walter's note keep doing it for her. Marcus said the room went silent in a way he'd never experienced at a family gathering. He said Carol's face didn't crumble immediately. It froze first, the way ice does right before it cracks, and then Priya set Walter's handwritten note on the table, face up, and slid it toward her mother. He said Carol's hand shook when she picked it up. He said Daniel, sitting beside his mother, read 3 words over her shoulder and went completely white. He said no one at that table ate another bite of food for the rest of the night, and Carol left the room without finishing her toast for the first time in the family's history. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. Some betrayals unravel loudest in the rooms where the person betrayed isn't even present. 2 days later, Daniel came to me. Not his mother, Daniel. He sat across from me at the same kitchen table, the one that had become, without my planning it, the quiet center of everything that year, and he asked if we could talk. He apologized first for not knowing about the deed plan, which I believed, because I'd already confirmed through my own research that Carol had deliberately kept him out of the details, the same way she'd kept everyone out of the truth about Priya's accident for 20 years. But then he asked something else. He asked if there was a way to move forward, for us, for the marriage, past all of it, past his mother, past what he called her mess. I told him I understood why he wanted that. Understanding why someone does something, and being willing to keep living inside the consequences of it, are 2 entirely different decisions, and I had already made mine before he sat down. I told him that for 6 years I had quietly protected myself in a marriage that never fully protected me back, and that the only reason our home still had my name on it was because I had refused, early on, to accept, trust me, as a substitute for documentation. I told him that lesson didn't only apply to deeds anymore. He asked for a second chance. I told him that forgiving someone and staying with them were not the same transaction, and that I was only interested in the first one. The resolution wasn't loud either. My name was already legally secure on the deed, which meant Carol's plan had failed before it ever left her attorney's desk. Daniel and I separated within the month, and the divorce that followed was handled the way I handle every closing. Thoroughly, fairly, without theatrics. I didn't ask for more than what was mine. I didn't need to. I already had exactly what I'd protected years earlier. Back when no one thought to ask why the quiet wife with the law degree wanted her name on the paperwork. Carol reached out once, weeks after the divorce was final, with a message that read less like an apology and more like a request for absolution. I didn't respond with anger. I responded the way I close every file that no longer requires my attention. Briefly, clearly, and without further correspondence. Some relationships end not with a door slamming, but with a folder closed and set aside, like finishing the last page of a book you already knew the ending to long before you reached it. 2 years passed. I left the firm I'd worked at for over a decade and opened my own practice, one that focuses almost entirely on protecting women navigating property and estate matters inside blended families and long-term relationships. The exact quiet, unglamorous corner of the law where I'd once needed protecting myself and hadn't fully known it. I've since sat across the table from dozens of women who came in convinced their situation was too complicated, too tangled in family politics, to ever be sorted out cleanly. I tell them what I eventually learned in my own kitchen, holding a decades-old note that wasn't even written about me. Paper doesn't lie, and neither does patience. Priya and I still talk, occasionally. Our relationship isn't what it was, and it isn't what I once mistakenly believed it to be either. It's something more honest now, built on the version of her that finally told the truth, even though it cost her everything with her mother. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's simply refusing to carry their lies any longer than the truth takes to arrive on its own. So, what do you think should have happened at that dinner table, the moment Priya slid that note across to her mother? Would you have confronted Carol yourself, or let the silence do the work? Let me know in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. If you want more stories like this one, women who stayed quiet until the exact right moment, and then didn't stay quiet at all, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.